It's November 9, 2021. I'm Todd Dunn, and I'm back in the boat shed again. Today, I am going to trim off the bungs and sand out the putty. I put on the trim piece on Tortuga yesterday and hopefully get a coat of paint on it. And when that's done, I'm going to sand out the epoxy putty I put on the voids in that plywood that I fit yesterday for the cabin sole on board Seaquestor, and we will go up and epoxy that plywood down. So that's the plan for today. Let's get going. Well, here's that trim piece, and everything up here is set. So what I'm going to do is just trim these bunks off with the oscillating saw, which should go fairly quickly. Okay, that's done. Now what remains is to sand this out, and then we'll mask it and put a coat of paint on it. Okay, this little strip of trim here is sanded and masked, and may not look great, but it is nice and smooth. So at this point, I'm just going to paint that the first coat of green paint, and hope maybe I'll get on another coat this fall, maybe not. Depends on the temperatures. So I'm not going to film painting because it's kind of a two-hand job, and I don't want to get paint on my camera. Yeah, I got the first coat of paint on. I don't think it looks too bad. You can't really tell, it's so dark in here though, but hopefully I can rough this up in a day or two and get the next coat on, and we'll be moving on. I'm going to leave the masking on just in case. Now that that's finished, I think I'm going to move on to installing that plywood on the cabin sole in the forepeak of my 1972 Allied 36 Seaquestor. So I'm going to head over there and get set up. The first step to installing this plywood was to sand out the epoxy putty I used to fill the voids yesterday. As you can see, I have done that. It's all set, ready to go. There is just a bit of a hollow here on one void, but that will be filled with thickened epoxy when I glue this down in just a few minutes. So now I've got to haul these pieces of plywood up onto the boat along with some tools. I'm aboard my 1972 Allied Princess 36 Seaquestor, and I'm getting ready to epoxy down the first piece of plywood sole. That piece is the triangular piece. It's going to go up there in the forepeak. And what I'm going to do is start out by painting the plywood where it's going to be glued to with unthickened epoxy. And I'm also going to paint the back side and the edges of the new plywood with unthickened epoxy. And when that's done, I'll put in a layer of thickened epoxy and we will glue it down. So let's start by putting in the unthickened epoxy. Now at this point, I have coated the piece of plywood with unthickened epoxy and coated the cabin sole with unthickened epoxy, and I've also put a layer of thickened epoxy on. So the next step is to glue the plywood down. So I'm going to go get it and we'll put it in and start fastening it down. Okay, here's the plywood, and it's going to go in. And what I want to do is get fairly even clamping pressure on it. And that's difficult to do on a flat area like this, but I have worked out a method to do it over the years that seems to work pretty well. So I get it to fit in there, and what my method is pretty simple. I'm just going to screw it down. I'm going to put panhead screws through this into the layer below, And then after the epoxy kicks, I will back the pan head screws out and fill the holes with thickened epoxy. So that this will just be a pure epoxy joint. Now I'm going to get in the way of filming this a little bit as we go, but I start usually in the middle, right there. Okay, one. We'll work our way up, one about every 3 or 4 inches. And this just gives me reasonably even clamping pressure over the whole surface. And this is a sort of procedure I always use, and I've never had a failure, so we'll keep going. Okay, I'm going to stop talking and start putting screws in, and I'll speed up the video. Well, you can see what the procedure is. It's pretty simple. Just put the screws in and they clamp the plywood down. And I'm going to finish doing this and then do the other piece, and I'll show you the finished project. There's no point in you watching me put in another 100 screws. Well, this is all screwed down, about 150 screws. A layer of unthickened epoxy, and then a layer of thickened epoxy on the old sole, and a layer of unthickened epoxy on the back of each of the new pieces of plywood, and then screwed down about every 3 inches with a pan head screw that doesn't penetrate the substrate below it. And when the epoxy kicks, I will remove the pan head screws, fill all the holes, fill this little seam between the 2 pieces of plywood, and then sand that out when that filler kicks, and we will then have a new layer of plywood installed and ready to accept the cherry and white maple cabin sole. Ugh, it's kind of warm working down there, warm and muggy. Anyway, this little project is done for the day, and I'm glad it is. It's hot, sweaty work. Even though it's only about 55 degrees in here, it's still pretty warm because of the humidity down there. But it's done, and all that's left is a little cleanup, and I'm done for today, November 9, 2021. Okay, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, please give me a thumbs up. If you have any questions about the technique, please put them in the comments and I will answer them. And if you haven't, why don't you consider subscribing to my channel for lots of exciting videos just like this one. Thanks for watching.